about micro-roleplays, as our main topic today is speaking games and how we can make them speak. Okay, so let's greet Mike with our smiles. In the chat. Okay. So, Mike, we are ready to listen to you and just to get some more ideas how to play with our students.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, ready to go. Can everyone see the presentation okay?
Yes, it's far. Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. Yeah, that's up. And can everyone hear me okay as well, right? Okay. So first of all, thank you, Elena, for inviting me. This is great. And yeah, as Elena said, I have a website where now it's not thousands of games. That might be an exaggeration, but there are dozens of games on there. And everything that I show this afternoon is on the website. So I'm going to try to make everything as clear as possible when I'm describing the games, but on the website, everything is there with pictures and clear descriptions. So if there's something you miss, then you can go to the website and find the ideas here. And any other, there's other speaking games, grammar games, games for exams, and things like that. So if there's something you miss or you're interested in more, then you'll find what you're looking for on the website. So yeah, so the topic then, let's have a look. What's the next slide? There we go. So the reason I put this presentation together, or the reason it came about, was I feel that there's in textbooks there's a lot of focus on role play for lower level groups. So for example, they'll do lots of practical stuff for students who are just learning how to order food at a restaurant, or students who are need to use a train timetable or something like this. And so at lower levels, there seem to be a lot of fairly practical and useful role play. And I feel like that kind of, at higher levels, it doesn't happen so much. So while some of these ideas could be used with lower levels, we're really talking about intermediate and above. And there are three parts to this talk. So first of all, looking at practical role play at higher levels. The second is kind of micro role play. So looking at very small situations, but giving students the opportunity to expand. And finally, third, role play situations that allow for collaboration and for problem solving. So practical role play. So for example, as I said, at lower levels, students learning how to go to a restaurant. Well, at higher levels, with very little preparation, we can give students opportunities to role play and have a bit of fun with situations which that they're comfortable with, and therefore allows them to expand. So for example, we can replicate real world situations. I can come into my class, for example, intermediate class or upper intermediate class, and give out some menus and assign them, okay, so half of you are waiters, half of you are waiting for a few food, move them around the room, and without much preparation, they can start a role play almost immediately, and they'll be familiar with that basic language. Well, after we've done that for one round, we can switch it up. We can add some character and personality. So for example, I can say, okay, now, waiters, this time round, I want you to be as rude as possible. I want to be rude and ineffective. Or it could be the other way around. We've got customers who are extremely demanding. And that slight spin, so it's a situation which I'm sure it's not challenging for them to role play a restaurant situation normally, but with this extra spin, it allows them to show off, to use a bit more of their language. At the end of that, so again, this is quite a short, low preparation activity, but once that's done, you can get the students to generate scripts of that kind of role play. So for example, if you're focusing on very polite language, you could ask your students to imagine the most polite waiter and most polite customer, and write down a script between them, and really focus on that kind of polite language. You can be quite specific. Here's an example game. So the language structure I want to practice is making excuses. I want my students thinking about really how they can get out of doing something, basically. So every student is given 3 small pieces of paper, and they write down 3 chores, 3 jobs at home that they really don't want to do. So we've got doing the washing up, cooking dinner for my family, and taking the dog for a walk. Okay, so everyone's got their 3 pieces of paper. And what I want them to do is imagine that the class is a shared house, that all of the chores that have to be done by the people in this house. And so what they have to do is to find someone, talk to someone, and ask them to do something. So, excuse me, could you cook dinner for the family tonight, please? And you want to give them the card. And the person you're asking, they have to come up with an excuse. And we've got some ideas here of some potential excuses or starting sentences. So, I'm sorry, I'd love to help, but I have a cold and I don't want to make dinner in case I'll make everyone feel sick. Oh, excuse me, can you take the dog for a walk? Oh dear, I can't do that right now because I'm waiting for an important phone call and I have to stay at home. So students ask and the other student makes an excuse. Now, if they make an excuse quickly without too much hesitation, then you can't give them the job. But if the person making an excuse doesn't make a very good excuse, or they make an excuse that you've heard already, then you can give them the job. And all of the students are going around the class quickly trying to find people who can do their jobs. And at the end of the game, everyone will have some jobs that people have given to them, and hopefully they've tried to get rid of the jobs, to lose the jobs that they started with. And it's a very quick kind of rapid fire game, and the feedback at the end can be students sitting in small groups, 2 or 3, with their jobs that they've finished with, and talk about how they ended up with these jobs and what excuses they heard, what were their favorite excuses. So again, my focus with these types of games are intermediate classes and above. So some preparation might be required. So for example, in this case, maybe a quick revision of chores, and some these sentence starters below on the board to give them a help at the start. But really, we're not crafting an entire scenario. We're just starting from this very simple game, and then the complexity comes about from the students. So if they're very capable, they will think of very elaborate, extravagant excuses. If they're not so confident, then there's still space for them to think of excuses at work. I love this type of game because the weaker students will get lots of input from the stronger students, and they can start using those higher level answers, the kind of more complicated excuses themselves with another student. And so the kind of class automatically kind of generates a lot of material that we can then use in feedback later. Okay, so again, it's a simple idea, very little preparation, but that the language that you get from the class is going to kind of expand and develop. Okay. So the next game I'm going to look at is kind of what I've called a micro role play. So this comes to the idea of like micro writing, where students produce a very small piece of writing focusing on the target language, and that's the same here really. So we're looking at practicing language in small chunks, 1 or 2 sentences. What we want is for students to create these memorable links, things that are personal and things that will help them remember the language. What's important here is that the students have an audience. They're not just sitting on their own, writing a sentence for the teacher to look at later. Okay, what they're producing has an audience. And later on in the game, it's open-ended. so that the stronger students are able to show off, and the weaker students, again, get that, are given opportunity to kind of listen to that higher level language. Okay, so here's an example game. I want to revise jobs vocabulary in this game. I want to practice using adverbs, and I want to challenge stronger students while keeping the task achievable for everyone in the class. Okay, I'm sure you've got mixed ability classes too, even if they're in the same kind of level, intermediate, upper intermediate. There's always going to be an imbalance. So I want to make sure that everyone is able to compete and complete the game. Okay, so the first part, every student on their own writes down 10 to 12 students that are common in their hometown, and everyone starts generating a list. After a while, I say, okay, now write down any jobs you can think of. And again, what this means is that at the beginning, the higher level students are given a very specific challenge, like, oh, what jobs are popular in my town, but then it's opened up so that everyone is able to do the job. Okay, so all the students now have a list of jobs that they can think of. And then groups, so we're going to put students into groups of 3. They compare and look at what jobs they've each got. What are similar jobs, any different jobs, things like that. And now every student in their group of 3 has a list of jobs. So I introduce our kind of practice vocabulary. So we're looking at jobs and adverbs. So we've got some examples on the board. Unfortunately, ideally, quite badly. And what I want students to do is to look at their list of jobs and pick a person, pick a job, and imagine something that they might say during during a work day. So they're given some time on their own to think of these ideas. They don't have to write notes, but if they want to, they can. They can write notes if they like. So I'll give students a couple of examples. So obviously, this is the perfect flat for you and your family. That's my sentence. And what the other students in the game have to do is to think what job fits this sentence. And so in this case, estate agent, great. You're running quite slowly, need to try harder. Could be a coach. So the students take turns reading their sentence or remembering their sentence, and the other students guess what job it is. Unfortunately, our suspect has an alibi. We can't arrest them. Police officer. This is kind of on the more challenging end for higher level students. We'll look at an example for lower level students later on. So our students keep playing this game, thinking of sentences that relate to the adverbs and one of the jobs on their page, and the other students guessing. Once we finish playing for a few rounds, we split the groups up and they pair up with people from other groups. And the first thing they can do is remember the sentences from their game with their group and get their new partner to guess. So recycling those sentences that we've just used before. The next part is they can take the sentences and expand them into a role play. So for example, this example with the police. Unfortunately, our suspect has an alibi. We can't arrest them. Well, what would the other police officer say in that situation? Can the new pair, can they make a short role play of that situation from this small starting point? Again, you've given students plenty of time. They can make notes if they want, but the idea is just for them to imagine that situation and try to kind of lead sentences on from each other. Same with the coach and with the estate agent. So it's a very short, structured kind of context for a continuation of the conversation. Okay. Once that step's done, bring students back again to their original groups and ask them to discuss, what the situations they were talking about, what were their favorite sentences, things like that, and just, again, recycle that language. So the objective really is that the jobs and the adverbs have been repeated in like authentic contexts, like a context that's kind of memorable and one that we remember. So to follow up from that activity, students write down a sentence for each prompt on the board. So we've got our, we'll go back here. We've got our adverbs, sorry. So every student looks at the board and tries to remember one sentence for each one, either from themselves or from their group, or something they heard from someone else. Once we've got these sentences, everyone's picked, we can look at pronunciation. So for example, if we've got lots of quite dramatic sentences, we can look at a pronunciation for expressing emotion. Again, taking students' sentences and giving this extra context, this kind of extra emphasis. We could repeat the game again. So the following lesson, repeat the game, but change it up slightly. And I'll look at that in a second. Or you could extend these sentences into a mini script. So they've got their written sentences down. Now what I want them to do is, perhaps for homework, take those sentences and take one of those sentences and expand it into a small script again. So like, all we've really done is given a thread of context, the idea of these jobs, and hopefully the students will expand and grow that context so it becomes something more memorable and becomes this kind of like situation that can be kind of role played. Okay. So again, I said we could have a version for students who are perhaps lower level, or for students who are going to find that kind of thinking on the spot quite difficult. So we can do a written version. Again, same concept, but written down. So this time we have our students in pairs. And instead of saying their sentences out loud, they write them down. They generate the jobs as before. Again, the game works as before, but this time they're writing their sentences down, working together in their pair, in their partnership. As they write their sentences, on the right side of the piece of paper, they write down the jobs that they're related to. Once that's finished, the students pass the page full of sentences and jobs to the left. So each pair has the sentences and jobs and passes it to the next pair. And as you receive the sentences with your partner, you try to match the sentences to the jobs and discuss why you think which some might work better than others. Once these sentences, once they've done, they can move around. There's a slight noise. Has someone got their mic on? I don't know if anyone else can hear that. There's a slight kind of rustling noise if someone's got their mic on. Okay, that's fine. So partners pass along to the next pair. They work out which jobs match with which sentences. And once they're all done, they move again. So each pair sees every sentence from every other group. What this means is that all of the sentences that have been created by students have been read by every student in the class. They're not just doing writing just for the teacher. This is written work that is seen by everyone, which I think is really important. For the final pass, so eventually the sentences will make their way back to the original students. And before they receive them, they have to fold the page so they only see the jobs. And now, with their partner, they have to recall the exact sentences they wrote originally. And this helps them, again, with the reminders on the board, combined with the jobs. They should be able to reconstruct the sentences that they wrote together. And it will help kind of reinforce that language. Okay. Of course, you could do this game with anything. It doesn't have to be jobs. It could be anything involving people. For example, family members, celebrities, superheroes, something a bit more colorful for teenagers, for example. It could be feelings or emotions. So for example, if you've got, instead of writing from the perspective of a police officer, they're writing from the perspective of someone who is anxious or someone who is depressed. What sentence would they write then? And again, the game works exactly the same way, but this time they're role-playing these emotions rather than jobs. You could even do something like animals or objects to be a bit more creative. And again, in this example, we looked at adverbs, but of course you could do any language you're currently practicing or revising. So for example, we've got here some phrasal verbs or some kind of linkers, some connecting language. Okay, so that's our idea of this micro role play. Any questions about what I've talked about so far before we move on to part 3? I'll allow some time for questions at the end. So if you do have questions about any of the activities, please let me know. I talked about making it a bit easier for lower level groups. Well, we can also make it more challenging for higher level groups. If you've got upper, intermediate and advanced students, I prepared this handout. So we've got some cards with some more challenging roles. Instead of it just being a job, now they've got to think about a rock star talking to a crowd, trying to get them to cheer and be enthusiastic. Quite a complex idea, but for an advanced student, it should be something that they can achieve, and it should give them some ideas, and it should allow them to show off. And again, I'm going to talk about showing off later, but to show off and really use the vocabulary that they spent all this time learning. So for this game, you've got your 3 players. They each take 5 cards each, and they have a look at their cards and they think about which one they'd like to do first. The reason they take 5 and not just 1 is because, as I said, some of these are quite challenging, and I want to give students a chance to pick something they are comfortable with, something they are happy doing. So each student gets 5, and they take turns kind of role-playing a short amount from this kind of character's perspective. And the other 2 listen to what the person's saying and try to guess. And again, guessing is also very difficult. So the other players in the game are going to be listening quite carefully, because trying to, like, if I, for example, as a student, I'll give an example for green here, a helpful travel agent making recommendations to an elderly couple. The student would just start speaking. So, oh, well, come along with me and I'll show you some example holidays. We've got some fantastic options. We can go to very sunny places, or if you prefer, we can go to some relaxing beaches. Of course, for you, I'd make sure that the hotel had wheelchair access and had very good lifts, and so that kind of thing. So like then the students are having to guess not just that it's a travel agent, but also what that travel agent is currently doing. Again, and for this game, for me, it's not so important that the students guess correctly. It's more that you have one student trying to be creative and role play this situation, and the other 2 students actively listening and guessing. If they guess correctly, that's fantastic, but that's not really the objective. The objective is that they're thinking, and it's getting them thinking about the situations too. And again, we can use different language structures. Okay. Finally, I want to talk about collaboration and problem solving. So a lot of the times when in the real world, when we're speaking, the reason for our communication is that we're solving a problem. So obviously this comes down to a lot of things like task-based learning, where the purpose for speaking is not purely to communicate, but to complete a task. I'm going to do a quick example here. I've got a few minutes left. So I feel like a lot of us might have seen the game before, where you imagine that you're going to be stranded on a mountain or stranded on a desert island, and you have to think about 10 items that you need. Okay, which 10 items do you need? And I quite like that activity as a speaking task, where students are thinking about what items that would be essential for surviving an island or surviving a mountain. That's great. But what I want to do is take that one step further. So once they've decided on the most important items, then they have to use those items. So here's the game. We've got a hiking adventure in the mountains with a number of different situations that could occur. And each one involves our target language. And in my example here, we're revising a natural environment. natural geography, dangers, things like that, rapids, thick nettles, things like this. So each of the situations comes about randomly when they roll dice. So students play in groups of 3, and they take turns holding the list of possible encounters. They roll the dice and read out the first part. There are 2 paths ahead. One is through thick nettles. The other is over dangerous rapids on an old bridge. Which path will you choose? Now, as the person reading the situation, I now listen to the other 2 students discuss their options and think together and come up with not just which choice to make, but why. I listen as the person who read out. I listen to their arguments, to their reasoning, and I decide, you can see the second part, if they agree on a path and give a good reason, gain a mile of progress. So through this game, if they work together and come up with a good reason together, then they start moving along this kind of mountain trail. What's important to note is, of course, the previous part where they got their 10 items. Any of those items that they think that might be useful, they can use. I've gone through this a little bit quickly because I'm running out of time, but there we go. So each person takes their turn, getting a situation and letting the others think together about a solution for that problem. So we've got students thinking of solutions for unreal situations. At the beginning, I talked about the kind of classic role plays you'll see in textbooks, things like going to a restaurant, going to the airport, and that's all valid and really important for low-level students. But for high-level students, we can think of unrealistic situations, ridiculous situations, and ask them to role play those situations. Now, even if the situations aren't real, the language that they're going to use is still going to be authentic. I don't want them to obsess over always doing very, very realistic role plays. We can do silly games too, and the language itself will still be authentic, even if the situation is a bit ridiculous. For example, deciding what to do about a bear and her cubs in a river. Okay, talking together about what they need to do in this situation. The language and the community that they're using is still authentic, even if the situation is a bit unrealistic. This idea specifically was about getting students to practice coming to an agreement. I was teaching the Cambridge First exam at the time, and of course in the speaking parts of that exam, there's a part where students specifically need to come to an agreement in a short space of time. And my students were struggling with that. So this idea of giving students a difficult problem, a role play situation, and asking them to come up with a solution together where they're rewarded for agreeing. And I think that was really useful. And of course, as we saw, it's a kind of revision of vocabulary too. Just like everything on the site, this game is available. And in fact, I've got a template. So what you can do is you can make your own versions. So if you just think of a situation that students need to work together to solve, and then think of different situations that might happen in that environment, then students can work together to solve those problems. I'll give you an example. I gave this as a homework to some of my more advanced students to make their own version of the game, and students came up with fantastic ideas. One of my students came up with the idea where instead of being stuck on a mountain and having their lives in danger, instead they were just trying to plan a surprise birthday party for their friend, and everything kept going wrong. So each of the situations was a problem that came up while they were planning a birthday party. One of my other students wrote a very kind of Lord of the Rings style adventure with orcs and goblins. And again, each of the different situations required students to think and come up with a solution together and collaborate and work together on that. Okay, just to wrap up then, each of these games, what the focus, as well as obviously practicing the language and ensuring students are speaking together, and have an audience. I want students to be able to show off. I don't want students to ever feel that during a speaking activity, they're restricted. I want them to be open-ended. So there's opportunities for students to really use the language that they spent this time studying. And it also, and so I've got a few points here. So in that case, students create memorable, funny, personal links with the language. So the more that they are adding their personal character, their personality to the games, the more that they remember the language themselves. And it's good for stronger and weaker students. Stronger students because they get to show off, and weaker students because they keep getting introduced to new language that's like one step above them, which is really useful for them too. And finally, yes, these open-end tasks, I want to encourage experimentation. That's the goal for me in terms of role plays. It's not always following this script to solve a practical or realistic problem, but allow them to really expand and use everything that they've learned away from very kind of closed activities in the book. Okay, so that's everything. As I said, there's a link there again to my website and my email address if you've got any questions. But I'm happy if anyone's got any questions now, then please ask away in the chat.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So if you have any questions to Mike, you can do it right now. Okay, Mike, you've got a very long question.
Yeah. Right, so I'll go back to that slide. So as students are passing, so each pair has written the full number of sentences and has all of the jobs on the right. So effectively what they've made is a matching activity for another group. So they've got their 6 sentences and 6 jobs, and they pass it to the left, and the next team receives it, and they talk together and have to match the sentences. So what we're doing effectively is, rather than the speaking game where they're guessing on the spot, instead, because it's written down, they're matching together. And as I said, each pair gets this matching activity created by other students. And again, maybe stronger students have been able to write 10 sentences, and weaker students have only written 6. That's completely fine. The activity is still kind of completed. It doesn't matter that some students do more or less than others.
Okay, thank you. So I'll put in the chat Mike's website once again, the link, a link to his website. Okay. Mike, do they create sentences as homework? That's another question.
So as a follow-on, so we had it here. So once students have effectively written down the finished results, these sentences, then yes, one option for a homework could be that they take those sentences and expand them into a conversation rather than a single sentence. So in our example here, imagine number 3, unfortunately, our suspect has an alibi, we can't arrest them. Well, what does the rest of that conversation look like? And it could be just a short interaction between 2 police officers, but it again, created from one student for another to then think about how that expands. So that could be a sentence. And of course, yes, you could create those sentences as homework in preparation for the next day. I tend to be a little wary about using homework tasks to inform games in the lesson, only because all it takes is for 1 or 2 students not to do the homework, or even if 1 or 2 students were not present in the previous lesson, and suddenly that input isn't there, and you can't really reliably do the game. So I tend not to use homework as input for a specific activity like this, although obviously there's other ways you could use homework for input.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I'm sorry, but we will have to stop here.
No, that's it. That's the thing. Yeah, thanks very much.
With Mike to make a series of workshops about games for different skills and aspects of English in autumn, and hopefully in spring. So please sign up to our Trendy English whenever you can, wherever you can. So just to keep updated and just not to miss this opportunity. Okay, thank you, Mike. That was it was nice having you here today. Let's give a round of applause to Mike, please. Okay, we are ready for our silent applause. Okay, thank you. And now, okay, thanks a lot. And now it's time for our next speaker, Graham Stanley. I can see that Graham is here. Well, actually, it's 5:40 in the morning. Yeah, in Graham's place. Okay, thanks for this sacrifice. Yes, getting up so early, well, it's definitely not my cup of tea, but well, Graham could make it and we are really happy. Graham is okay, let me introduce